I'm looking at a statement released by Tehran in the last several hours, and I want you to understand something before we go any further, because every major outlet covering this story is framing it the exact same way, and every single one of them is missing the operational reality buried underneath the headline. Tehran is calling it piracy. The word they chose is deliberate. It is a legal term, an international maritime law term, and Iran's foreign ministry did not select it by accident. When a state actor uses the word piracy against a naval superpower in an official communique, they are not expressing outrage. They are filing a brief. They are constructing the architecture of a future legal and diplomatic counteroffensive, because the military counteroffensive, the one the IRGC has been threatening for weeks, is no longer executable at the scale the regime needs it to be. That is what nobody is telling you this morning. The mainstream coverage is focused on the vow of response. Iran will respond. Iran is furious. Iran has options. That is the frame every network is running. And that frame, while technically accurate, is strategically illiterate. Because I have spent the last several hours cross-referencing marine traffic vessel data, Al Jazeera's sanctioned tanker transit reports, CBS News' detailed breakdown of the rich starry intercept, and Iran International's sourcing on the current internal state of the IRGC command structure. And what those four data streams tell me, read together rather than in isolation, is a picture that is fundamentally different from the one being broadcast. Here is what the intercept of this vessel actually represents inside the operational context of the Hormuz blockade. It is not an escalation. It is a demonstration of enforcement granularity. The U.S. Navy is not simply closing a strait. It is demonstrating, vessel by vessel, intercept by intercept, that the blockade has targeting resolution down to individual hull identification numbers, individual flag registrations, individual shadow fleet routing patterns. The Wall Street Journal's sourcing on Pentagon planning documents and the Washington Post's reporting on the broader operational architecture both point toward the same conclusion. This is not a blockade in the traditional sense. This is a controlled economic pressure sequence being executed with a precision that Iran's piracy framing is specifically designed to obscure from the international audience watching. And the vow of response? We need to talk about what Iran can actually still do, and what the GBU-57 strikes on Natanz and Isfahan already took off that table permanently. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That is not a maritime corridor. That is a kill box. To understand why Tehran's vow of response carries less operational weight than its rhetoric suggests, you need to understand the physical geography of the environment Iran is now attempting to project power through. Because the terrain itself has become Iran's most unforgiving adversary, more constraining than any sanctions package, more limiting than any diplomatic isolation, more decisive than any single military strike. The strait runs between the Musandam Peninsula of Oman to the south and the Iranian coastline to the north. The navigable shipping lanes, the actual channels through which very large crude carriers can transit without grounding, are even narrower than the strait's total width suggests. 2 inbound and 2 outbound lanes, each approximately 3 kilometers wide, separated by a 2-kilometer median zone. Every vessel transiting global energy markets through this choke point is moving through a corridor that a competent artillery battery could bracket from the Iranian shoreline. For 4 decades, that geographic reality was Iran's strategic inheritance. The regime did not need to be a naval superpower. It needed to be a credible enough threat inside that 33-kilometer envelope to make the insurance mathematics of global shipping untenable. Mines, fast boat swarms, shore-based anti-ship missiles, IRGC Navy harassment operations, none of these required force projection capability. They required presence inside a box that geography had already defined. That doctrine is now operating in an environment it was never designed to survive. 3 U.S. carrier strike groups have established a layered defensive architecture across the approaches to the strait that has fundamentally rewritten the electromagnetic and kinetic profile of that 33-kilometer corridor. The USS Abraham Lincoln's Air Wing alone generates a combat air patrol density over the strait that Iran's surviving radar infrastructure, degraded by an estimated 85% according to CENTCOM's own operational assessments, cannot meaningfully track, target, or engage. Below the surface, submarine assets are operating in water depths that Iran's anti-submarine warfare capability, never sophisticated to begin with, and now further degraded by the destruction of key naval coordination infrastructure at Bandar Abbas, cannot monitor. The Bushehr Naval Base, once the operational hub of IRGC Navy fast boat coordination, has been assessed as non-functional. The layered mine-laying capability that Iran spent years positioning as its asymmetric trump card inside the strait has been systematically degraded through a combination of U.S. Navy mine countermeasures operations and the destruction of the logistics chains that supplied and coordinated those assets. What remains of Iran's physical capacity to threaten the strait is a residual capability, real enough to complicate shipping insurance calculations, insufficient to alter the fundamental balance of control that 3 carrier strike groups have established. Tehran is vowing response inside a geographic box it no longer controls. The physics of that box have changed permanently, and the hardware that changed them is what we need to examine next. The operational dismantling of Iran's military capacity inside the Hormuz envelope did not happen through a single decisive engagement. It happened through a layered, sequential destruction campaign that targeted not the weapons themselves, but the entire system architecture that made those weapons functional. Understanding the distinction is critical because it explains precisely why Tehran's vow of response is being issued from a position of structural military bankruptcy, not temporary setback. Begin with the air defense suppression campaign because nothing else that followed was possible without it. Iran's integrated air defense network, built around the Russian-supplied S-300P Mu-2 system and the domestically developed Bavar 373, represented the most sophisticated layered air defense architecture any regional power outside of Russia had constructed. On paper, it was capable of engaging targets at altitudes up to 27,000 meters, tracking multiple simultaneous contacts, and queuing short-range terminal defense systems for low-altitude saturation attack scenarios. In operational practice, it lasted approximately 48 hours of sustained engagement before the electromagnetic profile of the entire network had been mapped, exploited, and systematically collapsed. The B-2 Spirit flew first. That sequencing was not coincidental, it was doctrinal. The B-2's radar cross-section, measured in fractions of a square meter, is operationally invisible to the S-300's engagement radar at the ranges at which the strike packages were assembled. The aircraft entered Iranian airspace carrying GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each weapon 6.2 meters in length, 13,600 kilograms of precision-guided kinetic energy, capable of penetrating 60 meters of reinforced concrete before warhead detonation. These were not deployed against radar installations. They were deployed against the underground command and coordination nodes whose destruction would cascade upward through the entire air defense architecture, severing the data links that allowed individual battery commanders to receive queuing, targeting, and engagement authorization from the centralized air defense operations center. When those nodes collapsed, the individual S-300 batteries went operationally blind. They retained local radar capability. They lost the networked picture that made them militarily effective against a coordinated multi-axis strike package. That is the difference between a weapon system and a weapon system integrated into a kill chain. The B-2 strikes did not destroy the batteries. They amputated the nervous system, connecting those batteries to a coherent defensive response. The B-1B Lancer entered the operational sequence next, executing the suppression of enemy air defense's mission against the now isolated battery positions, attempting to establish autonomous engagement solutions. Flying supersonic at low altitude, the B-1B's electronic warfare suite generated electromagnetic interference profiles that degraded the targeting solutions of individual radar operators attempting to operate without network support. Each battery that raised its electromagnetic signature to attempt an engagement was immediately acquired, targeted, and destroyed before it could complete a firing solution. What the B-52 Stratofortress brought into this sequence was not stealth or speed, it brought payload economy. Once the air defense architecture had been suppressed to the point where coalition aircraft could operate freely over Iranian territory, the strategic calculus shifted from penetration to persistence. The B-52 costs approximately $70,000 per flight hour against the B-2's several hundred thousand. In a sustained campaign where air superiority has been established, and the requirement is continuous pressure on regenerating targets, tunnel entrances being re-excavated, mobile launchers attempting to reposition, fast boat staging areas attempting to reconstitute, the B-52 delivers that persistence at a cost ratio that is economically sustainable for Washington indefinitely. That cost asymmetry is itself a weapon. Every time the IRGC committed engineering resources to re-excavating a collapsed tunnel entrance at Natanz or Isfahan, B-52s returned within hours and collapsed it again. The cycle repeated until the engineering resources were exhausted, the personnel were committed elsewhere, or the calculus shifted toward negotiation. The GBU-57's performance against Isfahan's underground uranium storage complex deserves specific attention. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists' March 2026 analysis confirmed approximately 540 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity had been relocated into underground tunnels prior to the June 2025 strikes. The Isfahan complex sits beneath mountains with concrete and rock overburden estimated at 83 meters. The GBU-57 penetrates 60 meters of reinforced concrete, deployed in the volume that independent analysts estimated from satellite thermal signatures, between 40 and 50 penetrating munitions in a matter of seconds. The resulting pressure wave reverberation inside a sealed tunnel system of that geometry does not simply damage stored material. It eliminates the structural integrity of the entire underground network through compounding shockwave interference patterns that no engineering specification designed for conventional attack scenarios had modeled. Iran's asymmetric doctrine assumed depth was absolute protection. The GBU-57 made that assumption operationally obsolete in a single strike package. When military analysts discuss the Hormuz blockade, they default to the language of barrels per day, tanker traffic percentages, and regional energy security frameworks. That framing, while technically accurate, systematically understates what is actually happening to the architecture of the global economy in real time. Because the ship seizure Tehran is calling piracy is not simply a maritime interdiction event, it is a price signal. And that price signal is now propagating through every interconnected financial system on the planet simultaneously. Begin with the number that matters most to macro investors watching this situation. 20%. Approximately 20% of all seaborne oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas transits the Strait of Hormuz under normal operating conditions. The Hormuz blockade has not simply reduced that flow, it has introduced a sustained uncertainty premium into every energy contract, every shipping insurance policy, and every sovereign wealth fund energy allocation calculation on Earth. Lloyd's of London War risk insurance rates for vessels operating in the Persian Gulf have increased by multiples, not percentages, since the blockade enforcement began. That cost does not remain at the institutional level. It cascades. Shipping companies pass it to cargo operators. Cargo operators pass it to importers. Importers pass it to manufacturers. Manufacturers pass it to consumers. The inflation transmission mechanism from a 33-kilometer strait in the Persian Gulf to a grocery store shelf in Stuttgart or Seoul or Sao Paulo operates on a lag measured in weeks, not months. China's exposure to this transmission mechanism is the variable that global markets have not yet fully priced. Chinese refineries process over 10 million barrels of oil per day. Approximately 40% of that supply transited Hormuz under pre-blockade conditions. Not just Iranian crude, but Saudi, Iraqi, Kuwaiti, and Emirati exports moving through the same choke point. China's strategic petroleum reserve provides approximately 130 days of buffer at current consumption rates. That buffer sounds substantial until you model the industrial output implications of operating Chinese manufacturing at reduced energy input levels for a sustained period. The second and third order effects on global supply chains, which remain structurally dependent on Chinese manufacturing throughput for everything from semiconductors to pharmaceutical precursors to consumer electronics, have not yet appeared in Western inflation data. They will. The vessel seizure that Tehran is characterizing as piracy carries a specific additional consequence beyond its immediate maritime impact. It has triggered a reassessment among neutral flag state operators, the Marshall Islands, Panama, Liberia, registries that collectively represent the majority of global commercial tonnage, about the risk calculus of operating anywhere within the extended Hormuz operational theater. When neutral flag vessels begin rerouting around the Persian Gulf entirely, adding 10 to 14 days to voyage times through the Cape of Good Hope alternative routing, the cost is not absorbed by the shipping industry. It is absorbed by every economy dependent on the just-in-time inventory management systems that modern global trade is built upon. Iran international sourcing on the IRGC's internal deliberations confirms what the macroeconomic data already suggests. The regime understands that the economic pressure being generated by the blockade is not a temporary disruption. It is a structural dismantling. The NBC News reporting on uranium deal negotiations and the Washington Post's coverage of the broader diplomatic framework both point toward a Tehran leadership that is calculating not how to win the current confrontation, but how to exit it with sufficient institutional survival to reconstitute over a multi-year horizon. That calculation, regime survival over ideological consistency, is the most consequential geopolitical shift in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And it is being driven not by the GBU-57s that collapsed the tunnel networks, not by the carrier strike groups that control the strait, but by the compound interest of economic suffocation applied with surgical patience against a regime whose financial reserves measured in days, not months. The math does not require a military victory. It requires endurance. And Washington has demonstrated over 48 days of sustained operational pressure that it has both the capability and the institutional will to outlast Tehran's capacity to absorb. I have spent weeks inside this data, and I want to be direct with you about what I am seeing, because the dilemma facing Washington right now is not the one being discussed in any mainstream briefing room. Here is the operational reality as I assess it. Washington has two paths forward from this moment, and neither one is clean. Path 1, maintain the blockade, absorb the diplomatic cost of Tehran's piracy framing, gaining traction in neutral states, and allow the economic suffocation sequence to run its full course. The upside is structural. A regime that negotiates from bankruptcy rather than strength produces agreements with enforcement teeth. The downside is time. Every week the blockade holds is another week of global energy price transmission, another week of Chinese industrial output compression, another week of neutral state shipping operators recalculating their exposure. The collateral economic damage to allied economies is not zero. It is accumulating. Path 2, accept a negotiated framework on uranium disposition and blockade lifting that allows Tehran's civilian government to claim partial survival, absorb the IRGC's inevitable obstruction campaign against implementation, and manage the verification architecture that prevents reconstitution over a 5 to 10 year horizon. The upside is immediate economic stabilization. The downside is that partial survival for this regime is a timeline, not a resolution. There's no version of this that ends cleanly. There's only the version that ends on terms Washington can enforce. That is my assessment. I want yours. Drop your tactical read in the comments below. Tell me which path holds and why. If this briefing gave you something the networks didn't, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Tomorrow's briefing is already being assembled. You will not want to miss it.